morning, everybody who is following us for this webinar in our Engage high-level lecture series. It's the second of its kind, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this second high-level lecture with Professor Mary Kaldor. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Mary Kaldor with us to talk about a topic: wars, old and new, challenges to European security, which could not be more timely. In fact, as you know, the Engage project is a project that looks into how the EU can effectively and, in fact, sustainably meet strategic challenges by utilizing all of its tools in the so-called toolbox of external action, and by consequence become a more assertive global actor. And to do so, Engage brings together 13 academic institutions and think tanks from across Europe. You find all the information on our website, the Engage dedicated website. Now, today's topic, as I just mentioned, and the title of this high-level lecture series, Wars, Old and New, Challenges to European Security, could not be more timely, in the sense that at times when we talked for quite a while now about what new wars could actually be, one of its old kinds, an old war, hit Europe again. And the question is, of course, in that context, what are the consequences? What is it that this interface between, on the one hand, a generation of new wars and the revival, if you like, of an old war brings to European security? How will the events that we have been facing in Ukraine, but also prior to Ukraine, shape the external action of the European Union in the future? An increasingly, on the one hand, geopolitical environment that the European Union is dealing with, while at the same time, new technologies of war are becoming ever more crucial. It is my great pleasure to welcome to you and to us Professor Mary Kaldor, who will talk about all of this in her upcoming lecture. Professor Mary Kaldor is Professor Emeritus of Global Governance and Director of the Conflict Research Program of the London School of Economics. And she has, if I may say it that way, pioneered concepts such as human security, new wars, and global civil society. Her elaboration of the real-world implementation of human security has directly influenced European and national governments in the thinking and shaping of their security policies. She has, and I cannot name them all, written many books and articles, including New and Old Wars, Organized Violence in the Global Era, in its third edition, International Law and New Wars, and also Global Security Cultures. I am very happy to welcome you to our high-level lecture series, and I will give, without any further ado, Professor Mary Kaldor the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm really happy to engage with Engage. I think nothing actually could be more important than thinking about European security and its contribution to the global architecture. There's been a lot of talk recently about how the European Union has to become a geopolitical actor, and it rather worries me. It's fine to talk, as Kolja did, of the geopolitical environment, but actually, if we really take the term geopolitics seriously, it's about being prepared to fight old wars. It's about emphasizing your defense at the expense of others. And my feeling is that the historic role of the European Union is to promote what I would call human security, to promote global security. That's the best way to be safe, and the safety of individuals, and to promote a multilateral system based on human rights-based international law. So what I'm going to talk about really today is, I'm not sure when Borrell or Ursula von der Leyen use the term geopolitics, they mean it in this classic sense. Maybe what they mean is strategic autonomy, acting more independently of both the nation states and the United States, which is something I think could be really important. But I do want to make this argument in this lecture and to try at the end to explain what it would mean for European security architecture. But to do so, I am going to start with reflections on the nature of new wars and old wars. Some of this may be familiar to some people, but I may reiterate things I've said in the past. So I think the most important thing we learned from Ukraine, which we actually should have learned again and again and again since the end of World War II, is that it's almost impossible nowadays to win a war. It's impossible to do what Thomas Schelling, the American strategist, called compellence, to militarily capture large parts of territory. Whether we're talking about symmetrical wars like Iran and Iraq or asymmetric wars, it's really, really hard to win. And we should have learned that lesson from Korea already, from Vietnam, from Iraq, from Afghanistan. Again and again, what we've learned is that military power is rather ineffective in the sense of compellence. It's incredibly destructive. It can be used as a terror weapon, which is what the Russians are doing now in parts of Ukraine, but it's very, very difficult to win. Now, this, and the reason it's so difficult to win is precisely something Kolja referred to. New generations of military technology. The advantage to one side or other from military technology, I know they're talking about rocket launchers for the Ukrainians, and that will make a little bit of difference, but just evening up. Military technology, even improvised explosive devices at the hands of insurgents, have really equalized. A Ukrainian girl can go and throw a Molotov cocktail into a tank window. So military technology is equalized, which is why it's incredibly difficult to win. I just want to say something about the definition of old wars. So I'm saying it's old wars that are difficult to win. And if you like, Clausewitz was the great theorist of old wars. And Clausewitz defined war as an act of violence intended to compel your opponent to fulfill our will. In other words, in compellence. And Clausewitz's theory, which is contained in chapter 1, book 1 of On War, which actually was the only chapter he himself completed before he died, he makes the argument that old wars inherently tend to the extreme. As each side tries to win, the politicians try to gain their objectives, the generals try to disarm the opponent, and hatred and fear are mobilized around the population. So old wars are about compellence. Battle is the decisive encounter. Clausewitz wrote lyrically about the decision in battle, which he compared to exchange in the marketplace. And the tendency of these kinds of wars is to become more and more extreme. So what I call new wars really developed as a way of getting around this problem, this fundamental problem, using military force in ways that will not involve battles and exchanges and defeat. And they've evolved through the revolutionary wars of the post-war era, through the counterinsurgency doctrines, through the low-intensity wars of the 1980s to become what I now describe as new wars. And I think what's important to understand about the difference between new and old wars is that it's not an empirical distinction. It's not so much about the wars now and the wars then, but it's about the logic of war. And the logic of old war is winning or losing. The logic of new wars is something different. The logic of new wars tend to involve mixtures of state and non-state actors, and they tend to be in it for a variety of purposes. They might try to win politically rather than militarily, and winning politically, it could be using weapons as terror, which is very, very obvious in the case of new wars, frightening civilians so they run away so you control the territory. It's more or less what Russia's trying to do in Donbass. They could be economic. It could be for looting, smuggling purposes. But the point is that what then happens as a consequence of this is that they do have a different tendency. Instead of tending to extreme, they tend to persistence. They're terribly difficult to end because all the actors are gaining from violence. They're gaining politically and they're gaining economically. And so they don't have an interest. In fact, they need violence to reproduce themselves. I think typically new wars are a way, I would describe new wars thus less as a military contest and more as a kind of social condition in which violence is a way of reproducing the social relationships. It's almost a new kind of social system that is an alternative to liberal capitalism, just as state planning was an alternative to capitalism in an earlier era. And more and more countries are being characterized by this sort of social system where violence is built into the system. And I think typically new wars are a way of weakening democratic demands. It's very interesting to see how many new wars begin with democracy. If you think about, let's take the case of Syria. So the Syrian war began with the demonstrations of 2011. The vast majority of the demonstrators were against violence because they thought that if it turned to violence, Assad would be bound to win. But some people, just because Assad started shooting at his demonstrators, some people formed opposition groups, and they were very quickly taken up by what you might call political entrepreneurs. And what you saw, in a way, was a class divide, the same class divide you see in Bosnia, that the middle-class protesters were not the people who joined the brigades. It was the rural unemployed, who often had no option and had no jobs. And very quickly, it got turned from a clash about democracy and authoritarianism into a clash about sectarianism, Sunni versus Shia. When I said that military force is quite useful for political control, it's also a way that nationalist difference gets constructed or reproduced, or religious difference. So the Syrian regime deliberately targeted Sunni areas, and the opposition were very quickly backed by private donors from the Gulf, who promoted their Sunni identity, and it became Shia Sunni when it had started off as democracy versus autocracy. So new wars are very often and nearly always linked to ethnic or religious difference, and they're linked to systemic corruption and economic crime. And I just want to say, before I end that little bit about new wars, one more thing. What happens to the demonstrators who don't want to join the armed opposition? Well, they either are forced to leave or they become civil society. They become the humanitarian first responders. They mediate in local disputes. They document war crimes. You see this in Syria. You see it in all war zones. You see these groups of, if you like, former demonstrators. And nowhere is that more important than in Ukraine, which I'll say something about in a minute. But what I think, they keep schools and hospitals going. I'm increasingly talking about it not necessarily as civil society, but as civicness. And for me, these wars are an attack on civility. They start as attacks on democracy, but strengthening and supporting civility is the main way to counter new wars. So what about Ukraine? Well, I think the Putin regime is very typical of the regimes that you see in new war zones. It's very similar to Milosevic's Yugoslavia or to Assad's Syria. It involves a mixture of crony capitalism, oligarchics, if you like, framed in ethnic nationalist terms, Russian ethnic nationalism. And from the beginning of Putin's rule, he's been involved in new wars. He started off with Chechnya, which actually was at the same time as Bosnia and even worse than Bosnia, but the international community didn't react. Then there was Georgia, then there was Syria, and now Ukraine. So he's always, new wars is part of his method of ruling. The Ukraine war began in 2014, as you all probably know, and it was in response to the demonstrations in Euromaidan. Russian oligarchs were very connected to Ukrainian oligarchs, and the democratic uprising represented a threat not just to the Ukrainian oligarchs, but to the Russian oligarchs as well. The Russian response came out of the playbook of Valery Gerasimov, who is still actually Putin's chief of staff. And he wrote an article in 2013 about the development of nonlinear war. He called it nonlinear war. It's what I call a new war. And he made the argument that with it, where he sort of likes to think, they like to think that the West promotes all new wars deliberately. And he made an argument that it's very easy with a combination of information technology, political technology, they call it, special forces and internal dissidents to reduce a country, and I quote, to a web of chaos, humanitarian catastrophe, and civil war. And that's exactly what they did in Ukraine. They tried to do it all through southern Ukraine. They tried to mobilize pro-Russian sentiments to seize administrative buildings, but actually in most places they were thwarted by ordinary citizens. They only succeeded in Donetsk and Luhansk. And what we have seen over the period since then is that the occupation of parts of the Donbass, the pressure that's put on Ukraine through the Minsk agreement and other factors, undoubtedly, the continuing war, if you like, has undoubtedly slowed down the pace of reform in Ukraine. So I think the invasion of February the 24th was a new phase in Putin's actions. I think the only thing that made it different was that it was a classical invasion. And maybe the consequence of that, the reason for that, was Putin's own hubris. That he, everyone says he was stuck alone with the pandemic, and he was thinking about how brilliant and powerful Russia was. And he really didn't get it, that there would be a Ukrainian resistance on the scale it was. Even though many people, including me, I thought he would never invade because I thought the resistance would be too strong. But what then, so on the Russian side, it is a sort of new war. But what is it on the Ukrainian side? And that's where it's really different. For Ukraine, this is a classic contest. They want to win, and we all want them to win. And what is more is that Ukraine is not like the various warring parties we see in new wars. It's a state, and we could argue it's a civic state. It has mobilized civil society in support of the state. Everybody in Ukraine is involved in the war effort, whether they're documenting war crimes, whether they're providing humanitarian assistance. Everyone is involved. Everyone's learning to do nursing. And the idea of Ukraine, which was forged in the Euromaidan demonstrations, is a civic idea. It's a political idea of Ukraine that includes Russians, Ukrainians, Jews, Poles, Crimean Tatar, the mix of people that make up Ukraine. And certainly when I was in southern Ukraine in 2015, I was quite struck by how even right-wing Russians insisted that they were pro-Ukraine because it was a political notion, not an ethnic notion. So this is really, if you like, a contest, an old war contest versus a new war one. But what will be the outcome? And here's where I'm afraid I'm rather pessimistic. I think World War I was a better pointer to future wars than World War II. It looks to me like it will be a long attritional struggle. And I think the big danger is that if the struggle continues over a long time, it will actually turn into a new war, even on the Ukrainian side, which I suspect was always Russia's intention. So I think very important is the aim of creating ethnic tension. And for the moment, it's not happening, but you could see that hatred of Russia could become ethnicized. You know, I've watched as many Russians are struggling to speak Ukrainian to show their loyalty to Ukraine. So that is a real danger. And the other danger is the looting and smuggling and economic crime. This is already going on in a systematic way on the Russian side. I think it's part of Russian methodology of fighting. But what Ukraine has done is to arm all its citizens. And there's a real danger that if there are shortages, if people have problems getting food and other things, this will also increase looting and violence on the Ukrainian side. And the other thing I feel very pessimistic about is the impact of the economic sanctions on Russia, which and I'll say something about the end. Well, of course, it was important to immediately impose economic sanctions to show Western outrage, in contrast to Western behavior when Russia annexed Crimea or in the case of Georgia. Nevertheless, the big problem is this is going to mainly affect ordinary people. It's going to mean that the sort of people who oppose the war are going to leave, and the people who are left are those most vulnerable to Russian propaganda and will see the economic sanctions as caused by the West. And I think you could see some dangerous economic fragmentation inside Russia. And so the end result will be a sort of new war on Europe's doorstep, which is very alarming. It would be great if there could be a diplomatic solution, if only to save lives. But any diplomatic solution will freeze existing territorial positions. And this is not just a territorial distinction, it's a social distinction. The areas occupied by Russia will be run by criminal gangs. And it will represent a permanent pressure on Ukraine, a permanent effort to try to undermine democracy in Ukraine. You know, a lot of people say, well, maybe Crimea should have been Russian. It only went to Ukraine in 1954. But the issue about Crimea was not so much should it be Russian or Ukrainian, but should it be democratic or ruled by a criminalized kleptocracy? When Ukraine was annexed, it had just voted in a pro-Maidan coalition with the Crimean Tatars, and it was replaced by a gang of Russian mafia who undertook property theft and discrimination against the Crimean Tatars. So the issue is less a territorial issue than a human rights issue. So finally, I've realized I think I'm okay for time. What does all this imply about European security? I actually think the Western response was a shift from a classic geopolitical response in many ways. I think the West is on a kind of tightrope between, on the one hand, the risk of escalation, which could lead to a third world war, which could lead to annihilation. That's what would happen if the West engaged in an old war. And on the other hand, supporting Ukraine and preventing Russia from succeeding in turning Ukraine into a new war system. It's a terribly difficult tightrope to work. As I said before, I think the economic sanctions are really important to express opposition, but I think they should have been designed differently. I would have started with oil and gas sanctions. I think oil and gas sanctions are really important, not just because they would have hurt Russia, but actually they undermine the very basis of the regime, which is a rentier regime. In general, I've been arguing for quite a long time that ending oil and gas is important not just for climate change, but for ending dictatorships. So that would be something I would do a bit differently. But what does this response then tell us about the direction of European security? Well, as many of you may remember, at the end of the Cold War, many of us who were involved in these debates hoped that the Helsinki process would become a pan-European security system and Russia would be a member. And it would be a security system based on the three principles of Helsinki, which I'll say a bit more about in the beginning: security and war prevention, economic and social cooperation, and human rights. But instead, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved and NATO expanded. And NATO, I think you can say, because of its history, is a classic geopolitical military alliance. You know, even if NATO did not mean to provoke Russia, the very fact that you have a classic military design geopolitical alliance on your border provides a wonderful pretext for Putin. I don't believe what Putin is doing is a response to NATO expansionism, but I do think it helped him. It gave him something. It gave him an argument and a legitimation for his actions. Actually, and this is a little aside, you know, people talk, particularly on the left, about the West's responsibility for Putin's behavior because of NATO expansion. I think if the West has any responsibility, it was much more to do with neoliberalism and market fundamentalism. I think what neoliberalism and market fundamentalism did was that they transformed Russia from a centrally planned system, not to a nice liberal bourgeois capitalism, but to a criminalized kleptocratic system. And we could talk about that at length, but that's just an aside. So my big question is, could NATO, now Finland and Sweden are joining, adjust to become a possible future core of what might be a Helsinki agreement? Could NATO become, which is another option I remember thinking about at the time, the military arm of a Helsinki security system? And I think what's terribly interesting at the moment is that you are already seeing quite considerable changes within NATO. Stoltenberg is talking about a game changer. I've forgotten his exact phrase. And they are explicitly planning to include human security in the new strategic concept, which will be published in June. So what would it mean to include human security? I'm not sure whether what I'm going to say is what NATO will mean, because having had a lot of talks with people in NATO, I think there's a lot of disagreement about what it actually means. But I think some people would agree with me about what it means. And I think what it means is applying the three components of Helsinki. So I think the first goal, and that's where NATO is the most important, is the goal is preventing war rather than winning a future war against Russia. And that does require a very different posture. It requires being defensive. I would call it defensive deterrence. In the 1980s, there was quite a debate about the idea of defensive deterrence. In other words, that you could deter an invasion of Russia by showing that you would mount an effective conventional deterrence rather than deterring by threatening nuclear retaliation. And actually, my view is, and if you think about this now, it's a much more credible form of deterrence, because if you think about the way Putin is threatening to use nuclear weapons, it's clear he doesn't think the West, and he's quite right, the West would respond with nuclear weapons unless there was a mistake or something. So I think it means shifting from, if you like, retaliatory deterrence to defensive deterrence. And it also means, I think it doesn't mean you withdraw from out of area or crisis management. It means you are very engaged within the UN framework in crisis management in places like Syria, because we really need to think about how to reverse the social condition of new wars. Otherwise, they're going to spread. And I'm not going to talk about that. I've talked about it elsewhere at length, but just to say, I think the role of the military in this is very much trying to dampen down violence and to protect civilians. So that's the first element, preventing war. The second element is economic and social cooperation, which of course has been affected by sanctions, is very difficult to do, but even so, I think we just have to be able to cooperate on the global challenges of our time. So it would be about cooperation on climate change or on pandemics. There's no escaping it. And then the third element is human rights, which I think has been incredibly neglected. I feel it was very neglected during the last few years when the human rights situation, say, in the Donbass or Crimea was really the big issue we should have been, or the human rights issue inside Russia. So I think, and I think what's absolutely fascinating at the moment is that this war is the most documented war ever. And the efforts to talk about international law, to talk about both war crimes and crimes against humanity is completely unprecedented. So the importance of human rights and international law is very important. And of course, shifting towards a posture of this kind, I haven't got time to talk about what it would mean, but I just think one very big issue is the nuclear issue. That's the elephant in the room. You know, nuclear weapons and human security are completely contradictory. You can't have both. So there needs to be, and I think, as I said before, what this war has brought out is the huge difficulties of deterrence theory. Deterrence theory, the problem is it's just not credible that somebody is going to kill millions of people. You know, and all this discussion is Putin mad enough to kill a million of people? Well, it's in Putin's interest to appear to all of us as mad. That's what deterrence does. So I think really shifting what we do on nuclear weapons, a start could be a no first use declaration by NATO, and an end to opposition to the Treaty on Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons. There are lots of other issues I could raise, but I'm coming to the end of my time. So I just want to finish by saying, well, what does all this mean for the European Union? So I think what's fascinating is that ESDP has, from the beginning, and luckily it was under the leadership of Javier Solana, who I know is part of this project, been evolved in a human security direction, and emphasizing, but at the same time, I think there is a tension within the EU between those who want to see the EU becoming more geopolitical and focusing on defense, hard defense of EU territory, and those people who see the human security approach as a model and see and strengthening NATO now in defensive human security ways, shifting NATO itself from being geopolitical to being more like a human security alliance. And so I would argue that's the direction that the European Union needs to go. I do agree very much with those who talk about strategic autonomy. I think the EU could be a very powerful presence in contrast both to the individual nation states and to the United States. And I think part of the shift in NATO has been the shift in the balance of power from the United States to Europe within NATO. But of course, this is a huge task. It's an incredibly important task. And, I hope we'll all start thinking in these directions and filling in the details, which I couldn't do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very insightful thoughts, the talk, Professor Mary Kaldor, on the new and old wars, on what it means for the European Union. Towards the end, you came to that, but also what the overarching goals should be facing a war like the one in Ukraine these days. We have collected a couple of questions from the audience, and I would like to invite the audience furthermore to actually post their comments and questions in the questions and answers box, which you find here on Zoom. So let me perhaps start with three at the time and post them to you to start and kick off our debate. Now, one of the issues that you already addressed in the context of the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, was basically how could the European Union possibly react? And one of our collaborators in the project, Gustavo Müller from KU Leuven, he was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about the danger of the EU overreacting. You alluded to that to a certain degree already in your talk, and his question is there a danger that the EU overreacting, so to speak, to the Russian war in Ukraine would step up its preparation to old wars and neglects with that, in a way, following your concept, the enduring challenges of new wars, that they are very difficult to win, that they are long, that they are asymmetric, and that actually these kind of new wars create dynamics to actually linger on, to actually be, so to speak, undetermined in their outcomes, and perhaps that's exactly the intention of the new wars, as you also mentioned. So this was the first kind of question by one of our collaborators, and then perhaps on the more also Ukraine related question. There is a question from Marcel van Herpen in the chat, who is asking what actually would be the risk of the use of tactical nuclear weapons by Putin in the Ukraine war. You already said something about that in your talk as well, but perhaps you can say perhaps one more time to which degree this should be actually taken into the calculation, or whether that, in fact, as you mentioned before, is actually a very unlikely risk, that there is actually such a nuclear, so to speak, a nuclear escalation in the context of the Ukraine war. And perhaps with these questions we start, and then we can furthermore take more questions in, which I have to collect now while you are talking.
Yeah, well, they're really excellent questions. And on the first question, of course, the EU has said it needs to increase military spending. And I don't disagree with that. The question is, what sort of military spending? I think that if the EU focused on military defense of territory, and on more than that, on being able to win an old war, that would be a very bad reaction. And that's what worries me about the talk of geopolitics, because I think if it did that, it would merely provide further pretexts for Putin and would not really help Ukraine. On the other hand, I do think Europe needs a more effective capacity, both for effective defense, non-offensive defense, and for playing a really active role in crises around the world, in places like, I think you look at Syria, and everyone after Iraq and Afghanistan was very against all forms of intervention. But the absence of the UN, the absence of a liberal peace intervention, really has been very, very sad in Syria. So we need a capacity to be able to support the United Nations. We need to be able to do crisis management. I mean, another example actually is Afghanistan, where I feel Joe Biden drew exactly the wrong conclusion. He said this shows we should never do nation building, and continued the war on terror. My feeling is it was the war on terror that really undermined any nation building effort, that when the West, NATO came in, Afghans really supported because they desperately wanted an alternative to the Taliban. But because the West went on killing the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, went on doing night raids and all sorts of things you wouldn't do at home, and because they allied with really nasty warlords in the fight against the Taliban, it really undermined any nation building effort. I don't really like the term nation building, but the point I'm making was I think the EU ISS came out with really good ideas for what you should do in Afghanistan, which is not have the war on terror, do a lot of local agreements, a lot of peace building. That would have been alternative, and I still believe that's possible in other places. So is the EU overreacting? I think it's definitely the case that, we have to condemn what Russia, look at me saying the Soviet Union, what Russia is doing in the strongest possible terms, and that there has been a problem of not criticizing Putin sufficiently, or not reacting sufficiently strongly to what he's done up till now. But at the same time, we shouldn't be preparing to fight an old war. And that, as I said in my talk, is an incredibly difficult tightrope to walk. And the aim of reducing violence rather than winning is incredibly difficult process, but it's one we have to, I think, embark on for the future of the planet, actually. So that was the first question. And the second question, it's impossible to know the answer to this question. As I said again, we really don't know whether Putin is mad or not. It's very frightening, I think. It's very frightening, not just the possibility that he might use tactical nuclear weapons, but it's very frightening that, he allows his aircraft and missiles to fly so closely to nuclear power stations. And Ukraine, after all, has already experienced Chernobyl. So this is what really worries me. I mean, one alternative, which I didn't suggest, is that out of frustration with attrition, Putin will do horrible things to the rest of Ukraine. And that's, I think, a real possibility. And it's a real possibility that he's not constrained by deterrence because he doesn't believe the West will respond in a nuclear way. And he's probably right. I hope he's right, because that would be even worse. But, you know, we would have to think about what would be an appropriate response. Would it be a convention? You know, it's really, we really are at a very dangerous moment. And as I say, I really don't know the answer to that. What we saw this week was that when it was announced that Ukraine was going to get multiple rocket launchers, Putin sent cruise missile attacks against Kiev. So it's, and I just don't think the answer is appeasement. The answer isn't just giving in to Putin, because that will make everything worse. I think perhaps, and we haven't talked about that, but I'm happy to talk about it, the most important thing anyone can be doing at the moment is supporting the Russian anti-war movement. But we could talk about that.
Thank you so much for your answers. Let me perhaps, before turning perhaps to the more global scale and what also this war signals in terms of the engagement of other actors and states in international security affairs. Let us stay for a while just for two questions, perhaps, with the European Union again. We have one question from our colleague Hannah Ojan, and she says that it was really interesting that you pointed to the idea of the importance to avoid new wars from spreading. But she also was wondering whether you would like to elaborate on this a little bit more and what the possible role of the EU could be in actually avoiding a spread of new wars in the future. And then at the same time, we also have a question from Ioana Bantuna. And she is saying it is very interesting to look into the EU and what its possible contribution could be with regards to peace, to European peace, but also to peace internationally speaking beyond Europe. But in the same context, she says, do you have any thought if it is realistically possible from an EU perspective to secure peace without getting ready to fight for it? So she is basically wondering whether there is, if I understand the question correctly, whether there is a gap between the rhetorics and the actual willingness to contribute to international peace by the European Union. Perhaps we can take these two and then move on to the more global perspective.
Although I would like a chance to answer the Brexit question.
Wonderful. Let us go to Brexit as well, just after okay. These Europe-related.
So the first question was, what can the European Union do to prevent the spread of new wars? And as a matter of fact, I think the EU does play a fairly constructive role in new wars, probably a more constructive role than many other actors. It's already developed. It does a lot of rule of law missions, it does a lot of human rights missions, it does a lot of support for civil society. And I think this is a case where actually there's a mismatch between, if you like, rather like the mismatch in the whole development of the EU between low politics and high politics. You know, the EU was born out of low politics, which was economic integration, social integration, and high politics was supposed to come afterwards. So we're still hoping they'll come. They're beginning to come. And it's the same in new wars. there's a lot that can be done in terms of local agreements, in terms of promoting the civicness, and the EU does try to do that, but it tends to get really thwarted. I mean, this is many years ago, but I did a study of the EU presence in Palestine. And the EU was doing all kinds of good things, like it was trying to support the civil police, unlike the Americans and the Ukrainians that were supporting new military groups. It was actually funding the entire Palestinian Authority. It was it had a mission to observe the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt, which was a way of allowing it to remain open. But all of these things were totally undermined at the political level. At the political level, there was a decision to impose sanctions when Hamas won elections. So the civil police was stopped because the interior minister was a member of Hamas. Salaries were still paid, but they were paid to individual bank accounts instead of through the Palestinian Authority, with the result that it led to the fragmentation of the Palestinian Authority. And the Israelis stopped the observer mission from ever appearing in Rafah. So, my conclusion is that the EU has over these years developed a capacity. It's not a sufficient capacity. It could be better, but it's in the right direction. But it's not being given the kind of political direction that is really required. And human security is not just a sort of grassroots thing. It is a political thing. It's about having a politics that puts human beings first and the safety of human beings first. So again, to take my Israeli analogy, instead of being for Israel or against or for Palestine or negotiating, it's about what's going to most support the security of both Israelis and Palestinians, and thinking through the politics from that perspective. Anyway, so yes, I think the EU needs to expand its capacity. And then the second, I've now forgotten the second question.
The second question was actually the question whether this is actually just a situation where we can say, well, the European Union is ready to talk about contributing to peace, but not really stepping up its own capacity to actually do peace.
I think it does need to step up its own capacity, but the capacity isn't just, it's not just a military capacity, it's a civilian capacity as well. It's about aid, it's about all these other things it's about climate change, exactly. which the EU does. And in terms of the military capacity, it is about using the military in a different way. It's about using the military to dampen down violence and protect people, rather like the police, rather than to win wars. And a very nice example I often give is that in wars, international humanitarian law says you can kill civilians if it's necessary for the military objective. For human security, it's exactly the other way around. You can occasionally kill combatants if it's necessary to protect civilians. And that means a very different military posture, which, interestingly enough, a lot of European militaries are discussing. They're discussing it in Belgium, they're discussing it oddly under this government in the UK. But so I think the experience of Afghanistan and Iraq actually has produced a rethink on all these issues. So I just want to add on Brexit, because I think it's a really good question. And my view is the Brexit phenomenon is very similar to, and when I said this on the BBC, everyone was laughed at, but I still think it's true. The Brexit phenomenon is very similar to the Putin phenomenon or the Milosevic phenomenon. It's not quite as extreme because we live in Britain, but it involves, basically, Brexit was funded by crony capitalists, many of them with links to Russia. who, once Boris Johnson had come to power, got all the contracts. The reason we had such a frightful mess with things like track and trace and protective equipment in the UK was that the contracts for all this were given to companies that had supported the Brexit campaign. I mean, Deloitte's the accountancy company. So it's crony capitalism completely, and on top of it, it's clothed in ethnic English terms, although it tries to claim it's British, but it's really only interested in Englishness and anti-racism. So the difference, I think, between Britain and Ukraine is that luckily we still have a very strong civic society. We have honest judges, we have a rule of law, even though all of this the government is trying to undermine with outrageous, the more Boris Johnson gets attacked, the more they come up with outrageous proposals, like sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. It's completely mad, and but it's all part of their promoting this ethnic Britishness and combining that with, place for these crony capitalists. And I think the other aspect is that crony capitalists thrive in raunchy states. They do particularly well when states' revenue comes from rent rather than taxation. In the case of Britain, of course, this is not the case, but it is the case that a lot of the money comes from the city. And the city and borrowing isn't that high. So I think that is a sort of form of revenue which is relatively independent of taxation.
Thank you very much. And before we end, we are running into the very end of this talk. I would like to combine a couple of questions which have been pointed out, and I think they're all worth mentioning. And I think they are a little bit about the broader global, so to speak, dimension of the new context we are in. The question is, on the one hand, how can we think possibly about China? Will there be something like a mirroring exercise being taken place in the context of the confrontation with Taiwan? But also some in their comments have been asking whether we can expect any constructive role from China interfering, something that we haven't seen perhaps so far in the context of the Ukraine, of the war in Ukraine. And then two other questions are whether we will see and do continue to see a spreading of the conflict in other areas, for example, of the world, for example, in Africa. To which degree is this part of a strategy, of a Russian strategy to, so to speak, confront the West and Europe? And last but not least, is the intervention of the United States, who we have not really been talking a lot about, is that rather to be seen as an instrumentalization of Europe? To which degree is actually Europe really a partner in the context of the response of the United States, or to which degree is there an instrumentalization of Europe going on from an US-American perspective? Lots of questions. I give you the floor and pick and choose whatever you
China
would like
was
to
the
answer.
first, the US was the third, and what was the middle one?
The middle one was about the spreading of the conflict to other geographical areas.
So China, I think, is really difficult, but I think you've seen a shift in China. I mean, there was a period when the Chinese were talking about global governance. They were contributing to peacekeeping, and where you could kind of imagine a constructive role in multilateralism. But I think Xi Jinping is really echoing, in a way, Putin in his efforts to use Chinese nationalism as a way of staying in power, which does make the situation in Taiwan very dangerous. The situation in Hong Kong is horrible. And what I'm hoping is that he will have learned the lesson of Ukraine, that it's not a good idea to invade Taiwan, and that Taiwan would defend like mad, just as the Ukrainians have done, and it would be a very difficult attritional struggle. So I hope that the one positive thing might happen is that the Ukraine war will put China off invading Taiwan. But it does make it really difficult to think about how you engage with China, which I think you have to do, whether it's for as I said, for climate change, for pandemics, and how do you China's much more closed actually than Russia. I mean, Russia, we do see anti-war movements that we can support. We do see conscientious objectors. But China, it is really difficult thinking about how do you promote civicness in China and push China towards a more cooperative role. I think that's really difficult. And I just read this morning an article about how, the one interesting thing is that there were people saying that China shouldn't support Russia in China. And there are various people promoting alternative security policies. But on the other hand, I read an article this morning which suggested that the Chinese are moving away from that kind of response and are becoming more and more behind Putin and behind the idea that this is a proxy war between Putin and the West. So the extent to which one can encourage alternative voices is really, really difficult. So I don't have a very easy answer on China. I've forgotten the middle one yet again. There's the US
It's
one.
spreading to Africa and in various regions, yes.
What I hope is the Ukrainian reaction may stop the spread.
Yeah.
I think if the Ukrainians had appeased the Russians, if the Europeans had appeased the Russians, I think this is what happened after Crimea. And I think honestly, this is the beginning of the end for Putin, but it's going to be a long and bloody end. And so I hope that it will reduce, and I hope at the same time the EU will step up and act as a strategically autonomous and be active in Africa and other places. Because actually it's just presence. I think if there had been a UN presence in Syria and the EU had been more active, we might have avoided a Russian intervention, which made everything much worse. And it's weird the way the Russians are working with both the Iranians and the Israelis. And, it's just terrible what is happening in Syria. So, yes, I think Russia would have stepped up had it not been for Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to support the Ukrainian efforts. Finally, on the US, well, I think Biden is okay on this. I think he was a disaster on Afghanistan, but I worry hugely about the strength of the Trump constituency inside the Republicans, about the way that actually Biden is failing to get through any of his domestic programs, which could well mean that that Trump returns. And I think the European Union, I don't know if it's being instrumentalized, but I think Britain and the UK have been very much the dominant voices on Ukraine in all this. But it's not just that. If you think about how Germany decided to stop the Nord Stream pipeline and the way that Olaf Scholz has reacted, a lot of it is to do with domestic concern and domestic sympathy for Ukraine. So I don't think the EU is being instrumentalized, is what I would argue.
Thank you so much. I think we had a wonderful, insightful, very, very, how can I say, I think challenging talk over the last hour, a debate that really brought us a step further to seeing also the complexities of the war in Ukraine, but more over really the bigger question how we can make sense of new wars and also what you at the beginning of your talk were talking about the old wars that are still with us to a certain degree, even though they come in disguise, if you like. I think we had a wonderful hour. I would like to thank everybody online for following, for all the questions, and to really would to also thank everybody for keeping up with us in the Engage project. We will have more sessions coming up, and we are very much looking forward to the next ones. Thank you so much, Professor Mari Kaldor, for being with us, for taking your time, and for your insights on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.